I think I'd turn it a little bit. It's the way I grew up as an urban kid in a sort of depression atmosphere, and you're being raised in the suburbs, which came after World War II, and with a middle class or upper middle class upbringing. They're completely different experiences. So I want you to look at mine from the urban perspective, where, like for example, we wouldn't have play dates at any time from the age of 5 till 17 or 18, or where you'd go and see one person. We'd just all go out in masses across the street into the park, and we would just play until our mothers yelled out the window, which was the Bronx communication system, to come home for dinner. It was completely different, not as protective as the suburbs were in the way that you grew up, and the planning of driving around. Of course, we didn't have cars then again, so everything flowed from the street. Nice streets. There were parks, beautiful Van Cortlandt Park. Your question was whether there were any parts of the world now which closely approximate the setting and environment when I was young and growing up. And I guess the closest would be certain parts of Africa, where, and other impoverished places where kids sort of make up toys of their own. Their parents are not helicopter moms. They're not hovering over them. The kids are out there. They become independent much quicker at a younger age. They're out on the streets, not tough streets in my day. It wasn't gangs with violence and so on, but out in the parks on their own. And so that's about the closest. Of course, our standard of living in the 30s in the U.S. was still much substantially higher than it is in most parts of Africa now. Tell you about my parents. Okay. Well, they were a sort of a study in contrast. My father was a very, very quiet man and quite shy, and in social interactions, when I observed him when I was young, he would be the quietest one among a group of 10 people or 4 people even. He would speak up rarely, actually. It was just, and my mother was the exact opposite. She was the total extrovert, head of the Parents Association, and when I went to public school, organized a lot of groups, set up the public library that was in our housing complex, and was reaching out all the time, had lots of friends, very, very talkative all the time. And so that was the difference. And my father, of course, was a hard-working butcher, so he'd come home, he'd work 6 days a week, come home tired as all get out, in the evenings, and doze off, often. And he was not much of a presence. He took me to a few ball games and so on, but it was because he worked so hard. At the butcher shop, Haft's Meat Market, where my grandfather and my father and one of his brothers was there for their entire lives. It was on Kingsbridge Road, so it was a very busy commercial area in the Bronx. It was, the size wasn't huge. It was a reasonably large, exclusively meat market, which of course felt the pressure once the large supermarkets opened up, and women, instead of shopping the way they still do in France, where they have a meat store, a cheese store, a bread store, they all started to go to the supermarkets for one-stop shopping. And that happened, I suppose, when I was about 15 or so. That declined and things got tougher. I think one other big difference which I left out in talking about my mother and my father, I think my mother was also more intelligent. I think sharper and certainly far more articulate. At my time and where I lived, there was no need for parents to encourage children to get an education. It was the community, the setting, in the amalgamated houses in the Bronx. That's the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union, was a central core organizing this very large housing project. So I think the population was 90% Jewish, and upwardly mobile people that either first generation or second generation Americans, where everybody assumed that their children would get the maximum education that they could. And in my days, that meant free education. College, City College, and the whole university system was free. It was $2 a year to go to one of the best colleges in the United States and recognized as such. And all of the high schools and so on were free. So education was encouraged by the setting, the environment, and you didn't need a parent to trigger it. Well, Yankee Stadium is a place that I went to a lot, and mainly with my friends. We would simply walk to the subway and take it to 161st Street, the Lexington Avenue line, and there was Yankee Stadium. And you could go then for $5, get a great seat. The bleachers were about $1. So we'd go, a whole group of us, to Yankee games. The game that I remember the most was one that my father took me to. He took me to a World Series game at Yankee Stadium where there was a huge shot out into center field that was going to clear the center field, which is very deep in the old Yankee Stadium. And a guy by the name of Gianfrido caught the ball. It was the most amazing catch I've ever seen. And that was a game that was memorable, World Series game, for a lot of reasons. And probably one of the most memorable, one of the reasons was because my father took me there.
What year was that World Series?
Oh, I
approximately.
can't.
40s?
Yeah, I'd say by 1948, 49, but that's a wild.
With the Cavs.
We go to Yankee games during the war, David. We go to Yankee games in 1941, 42, 40, 42, 43, particularly 1943 and 1944, where most of the able-bodied males were in the Army or the Navy, and we saw these, half-baked players, but some of them turned out to be pretty good, like George Sternweiss, that were playing for the Yankees. But it was fun to go during the war years. The New York Yankees, when I was young, sort of monopolized baseball. That is, they won every American League pennant. They won almost every World Series. A lot of World Series were Subway Series, where the Yankees would either play the Brooklyn Dodgers or the New York Giants. And we'd go to some of those games literally by taking the subway one stop from 161st Street to the Polo Grounds for a Giants game at 155th Street. So, and the great Yankee players, they're endless. There's Joe DiMaggio that I saw, Lou Gehrig, Whitey Ford is a pitcher. Then on other teams, Ted Williams, I saw him a lot, and the Yankees had what they call the Williams shift, as a lot of American League players had teams, because they knew Williams hit to only one side of the field most of his 400 batting average time. So they'd shift outfielders. The infield would have a different configuration when he got. I saw Bob Feller pitch. All of the great American League, you did not have interleague games. That is, National League didn't play the American League except in the World Series. Now it's different. So I saw all the great American League pitches of those days. Well, World War II, let's frame it properly, when Pearl Harbor occurred, I was 11 years old. the war was over when I was 15. So it was really the core of my preteen and teenage years, sort of like Bennett went through. So the things that I remember clearly were all of the older brothers of my friends were all in service, and I knew all of them because we had a very tight-knit community in Amalgamated, and when one of them was killed and a number of them were, that was something that really, really impacted, not the headline news, but that Donnie's brother, who used to play stickball here, was killed in Germany. Then the other things that I remember was what we did as kids. We'd plant victory gardens. That is, everybody would plant vegetables, edible vegetables, the kids. And we would actually eat that, water it, take care of it. So that was something we were involved in. And then we had the Junior Civilian Air Patrol. We each, at the age of 13, 1943, when we thought the Germans might come over with planes, we had an arm thing with a picture of a plane on it, and it's a Junior CD, Civilian Defense Associate or Assistant, CDA. And we memorized, learned, and studied the shadows and outlines on cards of all the airplanes, ours, all the U.S., all the Japanese, even the Japanese, and the Germans, of course. I remember that. And one thing that also the war dominated everything, our games, our bubble gum that we'd buy, they had baseball cards, and a lot of them we got those. And then we had Japanese war atrocity cards, which in color would show a Japanese soldier with practically fangs and a knife tearing a Chinese civilian apart with the knife or something. So we had a lot of that good old propaganda then. A lot of patriotism. We all collected, saved up and bought the war bonds. I remember buying dollar stamps, and when you got $18.75 worth of stamps, defense stamps, you could get a bond which would pay $25 in 10 years. There's those kinds of things.
Okay.
I was never in full-time service. I was 4F for the draft because of a spinal curvature, which I still have. That was a little bit of a funny story because I was in law school at the time when I thought I would be drafted, and I applied to be a Marine Corps line officer after graduation. I went through the Marine Corps physical exam and was accepted. Then I got a notice in my third year of law school to appear for an Army physical. And I called the Marine Corps. They said, no, you have to take that. You have to go through it. You got to know. So I went down there, and the guy in front of me was making all sorts of claims. He had pains here, there, and everywhere. And he, at the end of the line, was stamped accepted. I went through not saying anything and go to the end, and somebody says, one of the guys at the end that has the stamp, he says, is Haft still here? I said, that's me. He says, you have got to go back to the tuberculosis x-ray doctor for another x-ray. Oh my God, I got tuberculosis. So anyway, he took the x-ray, and he and two other doctors looked at it and said, he's got a scoliosis, spinal coverage, and it is just about a quarter of an inch too much. We have to give him 4F. And they told me they rated me 4F because the Army, the government didn't want to pay for all the back pains that I would get throughout my life. So, of course, I was kicked out of the Marine Corps thing, and P.S. I haven't had, knock on plastic, any back pain. So I was, however, in the active Army Reserve Corps, and but that's, we went to camp, basic training for 2 weeks every summer for 3 years. That also was during law school before I joined the Marine Corps, and that was a joke. We were a bunch of sad sacks. I signed up for the Marine Corps in order to get the deferment to finish law school because they were calling up people right and left. This was during the Korean War, and especially after the Chinese came across the border in North Korea and pushed MacArthur way back, they started to call up more people. Typical day in 1945. I'm in high school now, and the first thing you do is you take the bus for a 10-cent bus, a city bus, from the amalgamated houses for about 20 minutes till you get to the Bronx High School of Science, which is a few miles away. And the day ends at Bronx Science at 3:30 or so. Sometimes you're in an after-school thing like the swim club or whatever. And then you take the bus back, and then you're playing with your friends, with your buddies, until your mother calls you in, or your grandmother, who did a lot of the cooking. And eat dinner, then you watch. You listen to some radio program. And you do some homework if you didn't do it all during homeroom time at high school. 5.
A typical day when you were 5.
Well, 5, I was in kindergarten, right? So it was just lots of fun and play there. For kindergarten, I just walked, or my mother walked me, or walked with friends, less than a city block to the school.